again, I'm Trish Payne. I'm with Block Imaging. We're out of Michigan. I'm the OEM FDA Liaison for Block Imaging. I've been with Block for about 12 years. I've done everything from sales administration to logistics to compliance. I was a compliance officer for a long time. I've been ISO 9001 internal audited, trained or whatever, trained as an internal auditor. I haven't done that in a while, and now I think the bigger one is 13485 that everybody's going to. So I'm kind of not sad that I don't do that anymore. So, but we have somebody else who's taking care of that in our company now. I also serve on the medical device servicing community. I don't know if you guys are aware of that community. That's something that was born out of the 2018 FDA meeting about servicing and remanufacturing. Okay. Well, we are very close to becoming a certified FDA collaborative community. There's a process that has to happen. So we want to become an FDA collaborative community. So we have a couple more steps left in the process, and then we should be able to say that we're FDA collaborative community. I serve on the steering committee representing ISOs. There are 4 other ISOs who are on that committee. Scott Trevino from Trimedics is also with the NC. Got a couple Trimedics guys here. Sure, O'Donnell, she's Sheila, thank you. But so yeah, if you have questions pertaining to that, I'd be more than happy to answer those for you after this if you want to get involved with that. But what we do is concentrate on consistent medical imaging service for our community that keeps patients safe. I mean, that's essentially what the group does. We want to make sure we're all doing the same thing across the board. So if you want to talk to me about that, I can talk to you about that. We'll be, I think we're at booth 408 as well. If you. All right, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to take this scenario. We have an ABC hospital here in Georgia. And in ABC hospital, we have several systems. We have one CT, though, that has a recall on it, but you don't know that. We have a mammography system that has an outstanding field modification, but you don't know that. You have a system, you have a C-arm that is going to be end of service December 2021, but you don't know it. Why? What's wrong with this picture? Oh, and I did want to say, these are not ever rhetorical questions. I would love for you guys to be interactive. It's going to make this hour go a lot faster. But what's wrong with not knowing these things about your system?
Well, one is you need to make sure that the OEM has your information so they can provide the recall to you.
Right. Okay.
You're in charge of service. You got to do. You got to be able to maintain them and be able to change whatever it needs. If it's a safety recall, if it's a they need to be aware.
Right.
The patient is compromised. Accident or especially a recall.
For sure. So that's one thing I was going to say. Patient safety first across the board on anything we talk about today. Patient safety is always at the forefront. So if you have a recall that you don't know about and you're still scanning patients on that CT, that's a risk you're taking. If you have an outstanding field modification, and those can have safety issues with them, that's the interesting thing about how these things come out. You would think that recalls are like a really big deal because there's going to be a safety issue. But the field modifications that come from straight from OEMs, a lot of times they have safety issues as well. So they're just as important. What about this system that's end of service or end of life and you don't know it? What could potentially happen there?
You could have outside failure and then not be able to service your downtime increases.
Yes. Yeah. So we're going to talk later on about having a plan that revolves around tracking your systems, and then will help you too with end-of-life service systems. I've talked to a lot of hospitals, and it's amazing to me how many legacy devices are still operating in hospitals today, especially rural areas. And the systems are still great systems. They work great, but you have to know how to service them. You have to know where to get parts. You have to know where you can get reputable service parts. That's also key. So let's move on. So we talked about this. Your equipment is not functioning at 100%. And if you don't know this and you're still using the equipment, it is what it is. It's not functioning at 100%. Potentially dangerous. Talked about that. You can have a misdiagnosis or incorrect diagnosis. I mean, if the images on your system are not clear, you can miss, a radiologist could miss the diagnosis or give an incorrect one. And that also aligns with patient safety. FMI, still modifications, also they fix glitches in software that you may have. And then the EOL, we talked about this, the end of service, end of life stuff. You want to be able to plan ahead for those pieces of equipment to keep them running at 100%. So, all right, now we get into some fun stuff. I don't typically like a lot of words on slides, but when it comes to regulation, I don't like to paraphrase. So I will pick out some highlighted things, but I do want you to see the whole picture of what I'm referencing. If you want to read up on the entire tracking system, as far as the FDA regulations, what's required, you can go, it's all in 821. And then you have sections, point 1, and then there's A, B, C, and then there's, so forth. You can read the whole thing. This particular section, I just wanted to point out, 21 CFR 821.1c talks about the primary burden for ensuring that the tracking system works rests upon manufacturer. So most equipment that we deal with is class 2, class 3. So with class 2 imaging equipment, OEMs have to get what's called a 510K pre-market approval, and they first introduce it to the FDA to be approved, to be put out in the community to be used. It is their responsibility to come up with a tracking system for that equipment that works. That means they come up with a tracking system, they audit the system, and make sure that it works, and they can find the equipment. So that burden falls on them, okay? Now, you might be saying, well, that's where the serial number comes in, right? But we'll find out later, that's not always the case. We'll talk about that. So, finishing this out a little bit, effective tracking of devices from the manufacturing facility through the distributor network, including distributors, retailers, rental firms, and other commercial enterprises, device user facilities, and licensed practitioners, and ultimately to the patient, is necessary for the effectiveness of remedies prescribed by the Act, such as patient notification for device recall. So, tracking your systems with the OEM is extremely important. That's what this says. All right, so here's a piece of information you may not have known. Tracking obligations of persons other than manufacturers. So it's just not the manufacturers that have a responsibility to track the equipment. Section 821.30A says the distributor, final distributor, or multiple distributor of any tracked device shall, upon purchasing or otherwise acquiring any interest in such a device, promptly provide the manufacturer tracking the device with the following information. I promise you, not all the slides are like this. So, a distributor, a final distributor, or a multiple distributor of a tracked device. And we're going to go in a minute and talk about how those are defined. But for right now, those people have to provide the OEM with the name and the address of the destination, and this is in the regulation, by the way, the identifier used by the manufacturer to track the device, and we'll talk about what an identifier is and why that's important, the date the device was received, and the date the device was explanted, meaning transferred, or the date the device was returned to the distributor or disposed of. So, At Block Imaging, we have a process. So if we take a piece of equipment into inventory, we have a person who automatically, we have a process for each OEM, it's different. She automatically emails or does whatever she has to do to notify the OEM that we have that equipment. It is now ours, it's in our facility, and the address of the facility. So we do that. And we also are a parts company. So if we dispose of a piece of equipment by either dismantling it or taking parts off of it, we have a form they fill out, I don't remember the name of it, but we send that to the OEM as well and let them know this is no longer in use. It's been carted out, it's been disposed of, so that we do that just as a favor so they don't have to have it in their system anymore tracking it and wondering where it is when they can't find it. So, what are you? Remember, in the regulation, it said a distributor, a final distributor, or a multiple distributor. Well, the FDA defines a distributor as anyone who furthers distribution from the manufacturer to end use, not forms from. The final distributor is a licensed practitioner, hospitals and other types of device facilities, multiple distributor, device reusing facility, rental company. So pretty much everyone in this room who deals with medical imaging. If you're a hospital, if you're a doctor, it's your responsibility to make sure that you're notifying the OEMs, let them know where the equipment is, so it can be tracked.
How about repair facility?
A repair facility? Do you have systems in your repair facility?
Not imaging equipment, but
I know more about medical imaging equipment. We can talk after and see what that device is. And if it's a class 2 or class 3 device, it most likely needs to be tracked. There are some exceptions for some class 2. But all right, so question. Is any part of this regulation new to you or surprising?
Yeah, I didn't know.
Perfect answer.
That's what I'm here.
Right. What about the first part? I think most people know about the first part of that regulation as far as it's the burden of the OEM to make sure that they're tracking it.
Right.
What about the second part?
I think it's the biggest challenge. I've been at work for the federal government. So we have items moving all throughout the enterprise, and it's, you can't keep up, with notifying OEMs,
Okay.
at times where the equipment, so they're sending notifications to other locations where the equipment no longer resides.
That does not help you at all.
Trish, I was going to comment that, if you're a provider and you purchase the equipment from the OEM, you pretty much know that the OEM has initial tracking and they know where it is. But if you purchase a piece of equipment in the secondary market from somebody else, that might raise the fact that you probably need to reach it. Now, the provider of that equipment should notify the OEM that they have put that equipment in the facility, but that may or may not be the case. So you probably have an obligation to make certain that the OEM knows that that asset is now in your facility.
Well, according to the regulation, you do. So that's an interesting piece. The primary burden of the tracking system falls on the OEM. If the tracking system falls on the OEM, that it works. The rest of the responsibility of letting the OEM know where that equipment is ours. That's how the regulation reads. If the distributor has the equipment, it says distributor, final distributor, and a distributor is anyone who's taking the equipment, purchasing the equipment, distributing the equipment, renting the equipment. You need to let them know where it is. So, and back to your predicament. So when block imaging, when I first encouraged block imaging to make sure and make this a process and make it happen every time, that was kind of one of the things. Well, we're bringing in so much equipment, we're moving it so fast, and we're doing this and we're doing that. We can't, we don't have time. But what I did, and it might take somebody to do, is I went through and I created the process ahead of time. I did all the legwork. I contacted all the OEMs. I figured out who it is I need to talk to there to make this happen, or who I need to email. I developed the process and handed it off to the person who is doing it now for us. And now all she has to do is, it's done for her. She just has to email a certain person a certain piece of information. I mean, it's that quick. But I think that's what you have to do. You have to kind of establish that process within your company if you want to make it happen. Someone's got to be the person to do it. And it's important. So why a tracking system? I'm going to reiterate, to ensure that manufacturers or FDA can remove and correct potentially dangerous to defective devices quickly and effectively. It's just so important. I mean, you don't want your system to be the one that has a recall on it and patient's on the table and something happens while they're having a scan. I mean, nobody wants to deal with that. Nobody wants their patient on it. So it's vitally important. I told you we would come back to Identifier. This tends to confuse some people, so I kind of wanted to go over this a little bit. So in the regulation, it talks about providing the identifier to the OEM. Well, the identifier is whatever number they come up with, the OEM comes up with for the tracking system, okay? And most people think the serial number should be it. It should be really easy. You should be able to get the serial number, and they should be able to find the equipment as quickly as possible. But that's just not the case every time. There are some OEMs that do just use the serial number, but then there are other OEMs who have a separate number called the identifier to track. So the identifier is usually OEM specific. So like if you deal with any kind of equipment, they have something called a functional location number. GE equipment has something called a site ID. Philips is the site ID. But that's separate from the serial number. So it's linked to the serial number and to the location of the system. Why is it needed? Well, this is what I have figured out in my experience. There is sometimes, I've had this situation happen where there's the same serial number for different modalities. So when you're calling someone and you give them the serial number and they pull up this big giant list of systems, they're like, which one is it? You know, and then you gotta work through which system it is. That's why sometimes the OEM has a separate identifier. So they can distinguish exactly, find it quickly and distinguish what system it is. And then the other one is batch systems. I had this happen with mammography. There are some mammography systems that all have the same serial number, but different site IDs. So there could be, and then there's some C-arms that have our batch systems that got like the same serial number, but the identifier is the only thing that kind of separates it as a separate system. Does this make sense? Have you guys had this experience? Yeah.
Oh,
Frustrating?
mostly just for data. Because we usually have different fields for different things that we call them instead of all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, because the identifier is called by different things by the OEM, right? So it's an information number. It confuses people quite a bit.
My big problem is logistics when they receive data, serial. So in terms of trying to call for service, system. So in terms of maintenance, it's better to actually use that number as a serial number versus serial.
Well, I'm going to suggest that you keep a record of both. That's what I'm going to suggest. You always have both. We are actually still working on this. It's the same thing when systems come in, get checked in our facility, they're still in crates and whatnot. So you can't physically see the system. So if stuff wasn't filled out correctly on the form, and the site ID or functional location number isn't on there, you're not going to get it unless you have pictures of the system, which thankfully we always do, and always locate it there. We always get pictures prior to bringing it in, but I would suggest you keep record of both. Sure. And sometimes it takes a while. You can call, you can give the serial number, and you can work it back, and they'll figure out which system it is. It just sometimes will take more time.
Did you find that your process was more proactive in the beginning with the purchasing phase or reactive afterwards? I'm sure it's extra both. So
Oh, well, our process, that's interesting. Our process starts once we've paid in full for the system. That's ours. And so we go ahead and start the process. Because some OEMs, this isn't like they switch to site ID immediately. It takes days and sometimes like a week, I won't hear back that it's been switched. And I can track some of this. I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the OEMs have websites that you can sign up for and get logins, and you can track the equipment in there, which is nice. Because then I can just go in there and see how they changed that functional location number, have they changed that site ID yet, and then it shows up in that login. Questions about this? Okay, so we're going to go back to this. This is really important, but the urgent and important notifications is what we're talking about. So we talked about the tracking system, why it's important as far as for the OEM, so they can get information out to you quickly so they can get things fixed. But this is also why you need it, that first slide. You're not going to get recalls. You're not going to get field modification letters. You're not going to get end of life, end of support letters. So it prohibits you from being able to plan ahead. And then you're stuck in urgent mode, trying to get things fixed, corrected, or you're operating without even knowing, which is probably worse. Okay, so I just want to give you a couple of examples of, if you did what you're supposed to do with the equipment, changed it up, the tracking with the OEM, some of the things you would see. This is a recall for our Apex Revolution CT. But here you can see, this was from the FDA website. You can go there and all the recalls are listed there. You can search for recalls on the FDA website. You can check all your equipment out if you want that way, but I'm telling you that will take a long time. It's just easier to have this site ID switched to your location, so you're going to get this letter. But GE sent out a letter on February 8th, 2022 to all of the sites that they had tracked in their system, letting them know that this was a recall that needed to happen. And they also let them know in the letter that there's no charge. There typically isn't a charge to fix your equipment when there's a recall. But it's just another example of if you are changing that site ID, that functional location number, or whatever, that identifier to your site, you're going to get these letters letting you know. Okay. And then speed of play. I think you had mentioned this earlier. So downtime versus uptime. Cannot reiterate enough that patient safety is always the biggest concern for us. When we're refurbishing equipment, we want to make sure we have it back up to 100% before we sell it, and when we're servicing, we want it to be back up to 100%. But underneath of that, downtime and uptime is important too, because you have patients who are potentially sick and need to be scanned, but if your systems you can't get anybody out there to work on them, then they're having to wait, right? So if your system has not been changed over in the tracking system with the OEM, it will be difficult for you to order parts and call out time and material service if need be. So if anybody had that experience where you call the OEM because you're stuck and you need somebody out there now, or you need a part now, and they say your system is not in here, it's frustrating. And now your system's still down, and you're saying, well, we have the system, it's here, so then you're trying to get somebody out.
They're a little more rigid, right, on what they're allowing now, but to make sure that you're the person that actually has the equipment. So that's a battle for identity.
Yep.
With the OEM?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
We just had an incident where actually we sold a system here in Atlanta, sold a CRM to a facility in Atlanta, and we were helping the site out by going ahead and having the system ID. It's actually Siemens, a functional location number switched for them. So we notified Siemens and said, hey, we just sold this to this ABC hospital, so can you change it over? And they wouldn't without a sales order. So they had to have proof. So that is a good point. If you're going to switch these on behalf of your clients or customers, you might want to be prepared. We went ahead and sent it. We just blacked out the information. We didn't want them to know, that was maybe just between us and the buyer. And we went ahead and sent it, and then they went ahead and changed it. So we helped out our customer. But yes, they will want proof in many cases. But the other thing that I have had happen, and I don't know about you guys, but if you've purchased a system from a third party and it came like from a hospital or something and you call and they owe money, that's a fun one. That's a fun one. The site that had it prior to you owes the OEM money. And then I'm sitting there having this back and forth with them that I'm not this site, we don't owe you money, but we have this now, so what are we gonna do? So, yeah, so you want to head off all of those types of situations as quickly as you can and in the beginning, so you're not wasting time later on when your system's down and you need it back up and running.
Trish, is there typically a person within the OEM or a department that you reach out to that would be responsible for equipment tracing, traceability and tracking?
Typically, what they call an install base in most OEMs, they're typically the department that's tracking these systems. It took me a while to find the exact emails and people to contact to make this happen. And I'll give you guys my card, and you can contact me if you want help in knowing who to contact for a particular OEM. I can try and help you with that. It took me a while to figure it out, I'm not gonna lie, to make it a faster process. One where we can just email one person or call one person to make it happen. But typically I found it's the install base. I don't know if you guys have found anything different when do you guys ever change site IDs? No? Anybody else ever?
Exactly.
All right, yeah. So, any other questions on that?
I just comment, I have monthly and every other month meeting for different manufacturers, just cross-checking their base against ours, just so that we're all on the same page. Making sure that whatever is retired, our site IDs are matching up and our serial numbers.
Is this imaging equipment?
And biomed.
And biomed, okay.
That's a good idea.
That is a good idea. However, what OEMs are you talking to?
GE, Philips, Siemens, Logic, Alpha.
I might have another solution for you for a couple of those OEMs where you don't have to meet with them, but you can just go to your website and see all your.
Well, I also have access to GE, Siemens, the Philips portals. So I also check their,
Okay, yep, perfect.
but sometimes they aren't right.
Okay, we just talked about this. So I did want to talk about this. So, what if you don't know you have a biomed in your health system, care system, who doesn't know what's wrong with the system, it just keeps going down. You call to get the OEM out for T&M, but it's in the service. Now what? You didn't know it was into service. What's going to be your next?
Reach out to a third party.
Right.
So,
Just any third party?
Oh, no, for the certified
Yeah.
third party.
Well, I mean, it's probably important to point that out because there are a lot of third parties out there who will say, we have these parts, we can do this service, who don't have a quality management system, don't have trained engineers, stuff like that. And that might look like an easy option to call and have out. You might have more headaches than you had before if you do that. So you have to be careful. And that's why getting the letter that something's going to become EOS or EOL beforehand, that's where that comes in play as being very important because they usually give you at least a year to 6 months. And you can be planning, you can be vetting your third parties, you can be figuring out who you want to use for that piece of equipment. So have a plan for your EOS or EOL, end of service, end of life products. When you receive a letter with the date, just start making your plan, investigate your options for parts and service. And like I was saying, quality management system program is important. It's nice because you know they're following processes. They have trained engineers. They typically know what they're doing. There's a lot of kind of one-man shows out there who will say, yeah, I got this part or I've got this. But you don't know if that part's been tested and validated. Because used parts are great. You can use used parts, but you want to make sure that they're being tested and validated and still in good working order. That it's not going to be put on your system and work for like a month and then be done. Then you're back in the same boat. So vetting for those third parties is really important. And also, I know your hospitals, if you work in a hospital, you have a, what is it called, vendor mate, or all those approvals that your third-party servicer that you pick for your legacy devices is going to have to go through, and that takes time. You got to send in their documents, their training, their immunization records. I forget what else. I used to have to help with that. That's quite fun.
Do most of the OEMs have that end of service or end of life on their portals? I've seen that they have
Some
that.
do, some do not. One of the portals that I was going to talk about, Siemens has something called Team Play Fleet. That is pretty awesome. And when we get functional location numbers changed, they show up in our Team Play Fleet login. So that's how I can tell it's been moved over. I don't have to call them and they're on it. What's cool about that website too, though, it lists out all the components of your system, the part numbers. It has end of support, end of life dates. It has a lot of information about your system. And to set up this login, this is free. You just email the Siemens LifeNet Team Play Fleet people, and they set it up for you. But it's super convenient. They also have some documents attached to the systems. Sometimes PM documents, things like that. If you call out service on the system, say you need a time and material, it'll show up in that, under that system in that portal. Very useful.
That should be really good to know the end of life. Or, I mean, we go for capital planning as well for hospitals, so it's something that the hospital can budget. If the system is going to end of life and it's time for them to replace it, they need to know before to plan accordingly and get the budget. So
right.
Just getting a letter before and sometimes knowing it a year ahead or something, it might help a lot too.
And it might take you that long to find who you want to work with. I mean, and then find somebody who has the parts for that system, actually good, validated, tested parts. So, yeah.
And I had a comment on the parts. The OEM calls the shots at the day. I mean, they're the ones that can say those parts are good or not. So should you not check with the OEM to make sure that the third-party parts are valid?
Well, so you're telling me that only the OEM test and validate the parts?
No, I'm saying, the OEM has the authority to determine which third-party parts are the standard.
So to his, somebody, probably Cardinal though, there's the saying that you could any third. And so we have over 300. They wanted us to use declares that the OEM package. So there is some things.
So a restriction that you can only use OEM validated parts.
Because the OEM has they have the onus, it's really on them.
They're
at the end of the
responsible.
day. So,
But if it's under service.
yeah, in a
end of
service, then
life,
what do?
Third
Then
party,
you're making a judgment call
you are,
for risk.
you're
Exactly.
vetting
You know.
your third parties. That's why I'm saying vet your third parties. Because that's the only place you're gonna get those parts. Is the third party market, is ISOs.
If it's coming from a valid third-party part supplier, it's been harvested off of a system, which is an OEM part. So it's an OEM part, it's just been used previously. So the part itself is validated by the OEM, it's the original design.
As long as it's not a modification or a match.
Correct.
Equivalent to the part.
Correct.
You are allowed to use.
Correct.
Doesn't matter.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly. You're
Now,
right.
if you replace it with something different,
Yes, now you
then you're correct. I mean,
modify your system, which has the FDA and.
Yeah, you can't remanufacture.
Right. you can-
That's when it gets a little hairy. For parts, being a parts company that sells used parts, we have a parts validation and testing process.
exactly. We have a whole verification process. We bring in the equipment, we operate the equipment, make certain it has complete functionality, and then we take the parts off of that. So we have 27 testing pages.
So you have, and there are other ISOs that do the same.
Yes.
You just have to find the one that's gonna work for your hospital or whatever, and who you can trust to have good parts. I mean, at the point of COS, EOL, that's kind of where I actually did use another acronym for that, but it's appropriate. But, all right, so, and then here's an example of, so when we're switching site IDs over, this is Phillips, we get a letter. So we got a letter saying that this PV Pulsera that we have in inventory is going to be end of life 12/11/2022. So we have time as an ISO right now. Okay, we might not want to sell this. Do we want to go ahead and part it out, test the parts? That way we'll have some parts for those who are going to need it. Or do we want to, we're also an international company. Or do we want to sell this system overseas? There's a lot of places overseas that can't afford high-end equipment. So it allows us the time to plan for this system. Questions on that? Okay, device tracking is required for the useful life of the device. This is off the FDA website. Just want you guys just to know this, that the FDA defines the useful life of the device as the time a device is in use or in distribution for use. Period. So even if it's the end of service or end of life, the OEM still has to track it. As long as it's still in use, they have to track that system.
So even if they've gone end of life, they still have
They
an obligation.
still have to track that system because it's still in distribution or use. So if there's a recall on it, if there's an adverse event that happens with one of these systems, they're notified. They still have to notify you of that.
What's the level of responsibility that if the OEM has been fired, company buyout?
That's in the regulation. The responsibility shifts to them. They still have to track the systems. It's not like all of a sudden
Right.
they bought the whole caboodle, so they have to do it too.
We've had a few issues, not necessarily with that sort of acquisition process. Necessarily. Or fracking, they'll still hold and honor like at the place, but it turns out.
Interesting. Yeah, well, it doesn't change their obligation
Right.
to still track it. So just remember that. Who does the burden fall on in your facility to make this happen? or does it happen? I mean, I think that's like the magic question, like you were saying, you know, your equipment's moving so fast. And you just don't have time to do it. We ended up having to assign it to a specific person. After I created the processes, we decided who was going to do it, and that person now does it for the company.
I looked at display.
Yes.
And we had a sleep shop. It used to be. Siemens was still tracking that.
Okay.
In our OR.
Yeah. Okay.
So.
Did they remove it?
You've seen it from some third party construction.
Yeah, I'm sorry, did they remove your teeth break?
Yeah.
They did? Okay, good. Yeah, that happens sometimes. Well, actually, it's interesting. I live out of Atlanta. And so, in the company I work for in Michigan. And I was emailing to Chief's assistant friends. I don't know how they got my address. I have no idea. But they put 2 CRs under my home address. They're in Atlanta. So I was calling them immediately, like, hey, look, I have CRs here. Not in my garage. But yeah, it's kind of interesting what happens. But I could go on, I could see it, I can monitor it and send in whatever needs to be corrected. I recently had to add a bunch of systems. We had been emailing them. I'm not saying they're the fastest. In responding, OEMs sometimes take forever, but I do think they understand the importance of the value, and they will try to make it happen, and they are a lot of times super appreciative that I'm letting them know where the equipment is. Because that burden of tracking it does fall on them. They do get audited for that. So if they can't account for system. And then that was the last question. It's all your equipment tracked. I forgot to ask earlier, so how many ISOs are in here? Independent Service Organizations. So 2. And then biomeds. So you guys deal with imaging equipment and other bio. And that'd be a headache to me. All of the falls in that category. It's crazy. And then other like hospital groups, are there hospital groups here? Okay. Yeah, so you kind of get. So we have a couple of minutes. I figured we'd have like about 10 or 15 minutes left. I would like to try to do something really quick. If you could work with some of the people near you and discuss what this would look like in your facility if you don't have this already happening in your facility, or if you do already have it happening in your facility, maybe you can give the other person some tips on what you're doing. But just take a few minutes and talk to each other, because this is how we learn what's going on in the industry. Come here, we get educated, and we talk to each other about what we're doing, what works. Because ultimately, we all just care about one thing, and that's patient safety. Right? That people are being scanned on safe equipment, that biomed equipment is safe, up to date. So just take a couple of minutes and talk, and then I want to come back at the very end and just see if anybody had anything really cool that they want to share.
It's irrelevant. I mean, obviously, if we implement it, we have higher standards. Everything else last 2 weeks. Safety, the same thing. All the same. So, because we're back to normally goes through HHS testing. So all the information from the are on the contract that says DC. So here I am down in Atlanta trying to get some Texas fixed. I call them up and they're like, who are you? And I'm like, you know, we didn't ask for $25,000, whatever, $10,000. They distributed across the So this is one of the things that I think is going to have to work. Well, that's why I'm creating what's called warranty. That's why people want to add language to reading all the documents. So we have an issue with the company. We have copies of it already. Of the POs. Just tell them right out pat, here's the PO number, your problems by, they need to update my information. It's all the time, also all the records for the this is my man site. Agility has to notify we were in a steady state. We're not getting I said chasing them down.
Did anybody learn anything new by talking to somebody?
Yeah, I learned that we need to track them.
We need one of you in every class. Anybody else learn anything new? I learned something new. Anybody?
Tell us what's.
Well, Piedmont Healthcare back here uses a outside service to track theirs. So I'm sure you could find another company, an outside service, who you can pay to do that for you. It's your budget. But there's another option besides finding somebody in your healthcare facility to do it. Outsource.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
What do you do when you don't always get notices? I use Every Institute,
Oh, okay.
because I don't always get the notices from them.
Is that Free Institute? biomed systems mostly, or all,
Yeah, all.
Anything medical.
anything
Yeah.
medical? Okay,
As our large recalls.
yeah.
So
Okay.
we pay for an annual subscription.
Oh, okay.
And they can either play your story, you have, or you just get emails or local to your website.
Perfect. This is perfect. It's another kind of outsourcing it, pay an annual fee for every institute, and I guess you can add your inventory and then it'll flag it if there's a recall. Is that what you're saying?
Well, they have some type of interface, they can interface to your inventory
Okay.
and any alerts or recalls come up and they'll play, using the medical device number.
That's awesome. Does that include field modifications, like the OEM? Those are OEM driven, so I'm not sure. Don't know? Okay. All right.
With that, sometimes we'll get the alerts from ECRI long before we do from the manufacturer.
Right.
But I also will contact the manufacturer and say, whatever rep I use, hey, we just got this alert about this. Do we have any applicable devices? And said, yeah, but it's not going to be fixed for 6 months or whatever, but we're sitting here with an alert that see today,
Yeah.
but they're not going to work on it till 6 months from now.
They got a CYA, the ODS, they got right.
All right. So anybody else? Those are great tips. So you can outsource some of this, which is kind of cool. Well, that's all I got for you guys. So you guys have been a great group. If you want to talk about the medical device servicing community or anything else, I'm at booth 408.